When we talk about the ancient Mediterranean and some of the better known cultures from this region and from this period in history, the Greeks and the ancient Romans, of course, are two that pretty much everybody knows. But another culture which is also really vitally important and really kind of fits here in between the Greeks and the Romans in some ways are the ancient Etruscans. The Etruscans were actually known to the ancient Greeks as the Turanians. And we also have a region around them called the Tyrrhenian Sea, which refers to this. The Etruscans occupied central Italy, an area really that today we refer to as Tuscany, during early Roman times. And a lot of ancient Roman history, a lot of the legends and concepts about the founding of Rome really date back to some of the legends and concepts that we associate with the Etruscans. The heart of Etruscan territory lies in between the Arno and the Tiber rivers of central Italy. And during roughly the 8th through 7th centuries BCE, the Etruscans really became very powerful and very wealthy. Etruscans were really good at seamanship. They were very effective traders, and also they had some natural resources, including tin. And as a result of their seafaring ability and their material wealth, they actually became quite powerful financially speaking. They were able to purchase lots and lots of Greek goods, for example, which is one of the reasons why we find lots of examples of Greek pottery, for example, within Etruscan tombs. And by about the 6th century, they controlled really central and northern Italy. They had a series of stronghold cities. The Etruscans never really unified, though. They never became a centralized governmental entity. They were always a series of really independent city-states that were affiliated loosely through a common language and religion. The surviving material culture that we have from the Etruscans differs from the ancient Greek examples we'd be looking at in a lot of fairly dramatic ways. We see some examples of objects that really don't have any clear counterparts with the art of the ancient Greeks. Here we're looking at an example of a very large sarcophagus. The Etruscans actually cremated their dead. That was a fairly common practice in Italy at the time. And we actually see it's fairly common that there was terracotta, clay-constructed ceramic, life-size sculpture. So this seems to be one of the more popular forms of art that we see when we look at the Etruscans. And the example that we're looking at here is really a very large-scale terracotta sarcophagus. Was originally created in 4 sections, fired and painted and assembled, as you can see here. And it essentially represents a man and a woman reclining on a banquet couch. And by the way, this is, just in terms of content, quite different than what we would expect to see if we were talking about the ancient Greeks. While both the Greeks and the Romans held banquets, the major difference with the Etruscans is that their wives were allowed to attend. And of course, the Greeks did not do that. So this would have been kind of considered scandalous by the Greeks. So we have this husband and wife here reclining on this banquet couch, which again would have contained their ashes. The example really is unusual. We don't see things like this when we talk about some of the other cultures of the region. Again, the Greeks wouldn't have had a comparable counterpart to this. This particular example also has some kind of interesting things going on when we look at the anatomy and the structure of the figures. So it dates to about 520 BCE, so this is contemporaneous with some of the examples of archaic Greek statuary that we've discussed. And we have some similar characteristics. You have these kind of simplified, almost iconographical imagery with the faces, these very idealized and yet somewhat simplified visage that we can see with these two characters. So what we're looking at is probably not a really accurate likeness of these individuals, but it's intended essentially to represent them. We can see that in what appears to be the somewhat idealized physique of the figures and other features as well. The anatomy is not accurate either. If we take a careful look at these two figures, look at their torsos, their legs, and then look at the sharp turn of their body as they rise, it's really a physically impossible pose. They essentially bend at a 90-degree angle. But we have this really dramatic sense of gesture and articulation with their hands, very vibrant faces. And this is really also quite dramatic in terms of its contrast with Greek and also Egyptian statuary. They're not so rigid. They're much more lifelike. They're much more vivid and lively. And we see that as one of the standard types of conventions really with Etruscan work. There's this much greater sense of activity and motion and energy. If we look here at an example of an Egyptian artwork that we've already looked at, discussed, and analyzed, we can clearly see that there are some strong contrasts between these works. And there's some similarities as well. In both cases, we're talking really about an image of a married man and woman. And these are really both, of course, intended for a funerary context. But the differences here are really quite dramatic. The material is an obvious one, of course. The statue on the left is made of diorite, very hard, durable stone. On the right, of course, we have terracotta. And obviously the context is quite different with, Egyptian on the left and Etruscan on the right. But in terms of style, we can really get this sense of rigidity, permanence, and inflexibility when we look at the Egyptian example. But on the right, with these Etruscan figures, it's much more lively. We get this real sense of activity and motion and movement, which we do not, of course, see when we look at the Egyptian example. So when we talked about examples of statuary, of sculpture, it's pretty clear to see some of the clear contrast between the Etruscans and the Greeks or the Egyptians. And when we look at architecture, we can also see some interesting similarities and differences. What we're looking at here is not an actual example of an Etruscan temple because none of those exist. And this is one of the major differences, by the way. When we talk about the ancient Etruscans, when we look at their architecture, what we tend to look at and study, in fact, is actually their tombs. When we talk about the Greeks, we tend to look at and study their temples. And this is kind of a key contrast. See, the Greeks, they focused on and built their temples out of stone, and these temples were, of course, very permanent and important structures. But we really don't have any Greek tombs that we really study and look at intensively. This just wasn't really part of their culture. However, when we talk about the ancient Etruscans, it's all about the tombs. That's the primary thing that remains because their temples were in fact not made of durable materials. Their temples were made of mud brick and wood on a stone base, but as a result we have some surviving foundations and no surviving temples. So we do have a written account by the historian Vitruvius that tells us quite a bit about these though. And from his description, we're able to cobble together some images and get an idea of how an Etruscan temple would have actually appeared. What we're looking at here is a model, and this is a model described by Vitruvius that really represents kind of a typical Etruscan temple. And it's quite different from the Greek temple in a lot of ways. First off, we have this very, very deep porch that you can see here. And the roof line really covers about half of that foundation with this very large porch. And the columns are much more widely spaced. And this, of course, is because of the fact that the roof and everything else in the columns are all made of wood. So they're much lighter. You don't need the same kind of density you'd have with stone architecture. We also have a cella, or naos here, which is tripartite. We have three different sections, Titinia, Uni, and Minerva, which, of course, are the Etruscan counterparts of some of the better-known Greek gods. Well, by the way, find that, of course, many people know that the Greek and Roman gods are really kind of the same people, just simply renamed, and the Etruscan gods are actually the same thing as well. We have, Minerva, for example, is also known as Athena. When we talk about the ancient Greeks, we talk about Heracles, who we know as Hercules with the Romans, or Hercule when we're talking about the ancient Etruscans. Apollo, likewise, is known as Apullu when we're talking about the ancient Etruscans. So here, when we take a look at this example and we look at this temple, we can see that it differs in terms of the spacing, the use of multiple sanctuaries within the cella, and also if we look at the statuary located on the temple. So instead of having statues inside of a pediment or as part of a frieze, processional frieze or metopes, what we have here is actually terracotta statuary lining the rooftop. So along the roof line. And that is another key difference that we tend to see when we look at Etruscan examples. So here we're looking at a plan view of the Temple of Minerva. And this is actually attributed to Vulca of Veii. Vulca was a very well-known Etruscan artist. He's almost like the Etruscan equivalent, really, of Phidias. Well known as being a famous sculptor. He actually was probably best known for one work in particular, which was a massive sculpture that he did of Jupiter for the Romans, which was placed in their Capitoline Temple. His sculpture of Jupiter was so large that it actually swelled a little bit in the firing, and they had to disassemble the furnace in order to remove it because of its massive scale. But the temple that we're looking at here, again, is a typical example of an Etruscan floor plan. You can see the three-part cella or naos. We can also see that if you look at the porch at the front, this is also evident in the model we just looked at. We have a stairway which leads up onto the top, onto the foundation or stylobate, which is really frontal and located just on one side. The Greek version of this, of course, we would have the stereobate and thereby steps really all the way around the temple. So another key difference here is that really an Etruscan temple is it's a very linear thing. It has a front, a distinct front, whereas Greek temples really can be approached from any side. The example that we're looking at here is a surviving example from the famous Portinaccio Temple in Veii, Italy. And this work is in fact typically attributed to Vulca of Veii as well. The image that we're looking at here is Apullu, who we also know probably a little better as Apollo. And this, of course, would have been originally painted in its original condition. It's made of terracotta clay. And it would have been part of a sculptural group along the roof line of the temple, which would have also included Heracles, or if we're talking about, again, the Etruscan version, Hercule. In this case, we would have seen Apullu confronting Hercule about the possession of the Cernian hind, which relates back to Heracles and his labors, the journey he had to go through in order to really achieve his deification. So the example that we're looking at here is one of several statues. There were at least 4 originally in the group, and it's probably really the best surviving example of this style of work. When we look at this, we can also see that it has the same Etruscan concept of these kind of swelling contours. There's a tremendous amount of movement. It's very, very energetic. And this is one of the ways in which it really differs from Greek work of the same period. If we look here at a comparison with a Greek example from the same period, in this case, of course, the Peplos Kore, we can see that the Greek example is much more reserved in terms of pose. It's much more formal, much more rigid, a little more Egyptian influence there possibly, whereas the Greek version is much more volumetric, much more active. The Greek versions tend to we have this greater sense of idealism of the figure. We can see that Apullu here is probably eating pretty well. And the sense of drapery is much, much more stylized when we look at the Etruscan example. And these are kind of typical features that we see when we look at and discuss Etruscan artwork. So as I mentioned previously, we don't have any surviving examples of Etruscan temples, but we do have Etruscan tombs. Etruscan tombs were typically actually carved out of the bedrock, out of tufa, which is a very soft volcanic stone. And many of these survive, and we find them actually in clusters and groups in what we call a necropolis. And there are several examples of Etruscan necropoli. These are basically cities of the dead, if you will. And one of the most famous of these is the necropolis located at Tarquinia. And we're looking here at an example of one of these surviving tombs. And this is known as the tomb of the Triclinium. So it's basically a single chamber. It's a single room tomb. And the word Triclinium actually refers back to a type of 3-couch dining room, which was common in the Greco-Roman world. And that's what we see here, essentially, is a room that's styled after a triclinium or a banqueting room. And it's interesting, when we look at Etruscan tombs, they actually look like what we believe Etruscan homes would have been shaped like. They actually have, in many cases, examples of furniture and all sorts of other stuff carved into the walls or into the surfaces. It's as if really the Etruscans were attempting to replicate all of the comforts of home, but do it in a permanent medium like stone. We see grave goods and offerings, as well as the remains of the deceased within these structures. And not all, but many of them are also painted. And in this case, what we're looking at here is a series of frescoes painted on the walls in this tomb. It dates to about 470 BCE. And on the rear wall of the tomb, we have the main scene here, which is one of basically a dinner party. And we can see this has some similarities when we talk about some of the pottery that these Etruscans would have been familiar with, that they imported from ancient Greece. And on the back there, we see a group of individuals. We see reclining diners. We also see attendants tending to their needs and bringing them goods and foods and that sort of thing. They're dressed in bright and beautiful clothing, which tells us these are probably people of elite status. And we also see some animal imagery. There's quite a few animals also depicted within some of these scenes. So in addition to having the scenes of the people feasting on the back wall, there are also scenes on the left and right walls of this tomb, including what we see here. This is an example, a detail of one of these scenes of a barbiton player on the left wall. We have images of people dancing and musicians as well represented when we look at these surfaces. This tells us a little bit, actually, probably about Etruscan funerals, because more than likely what we're seeing represented here is an image of the actual funeral. And we know that in a lot of cases in the ancient Mediterranean, that funerals were really kind of celebrations to some extent as well. There would be, acrobatic contests and games and music and dining and a variety of other things which took place. So all of this imagery that we see here in total probably is intended to represent probably the actual process of the funeral that would have taken place. So here we're looking at some imagery from the right wall. You can see a pair of dancers here. The ceiling, by the way, is actually checkered in a pattern which may represent the type of fabric or cloth which would have been used to cover over the actual funeral pavilion when the event actually took place. But these dancers here, and really the whole scene altogether, give us this sense of this festival really that took place with this funeral. And to some extent, this is intended to mark the passage of the deceased into the afterlife, but it also had ramifications really into the existing world, the present day world. Doing stuff like this, it showed the socioeconomic power and status of the family that was hosting this, and also served to continue to communicate and confer this idea about socioeconomic status and position for the family that held this particular event. When we talk about the media that the Etruscans are best known for in terms of sculpture, we've already seen several examples of terracotta, which they're very well known for their skill and mastery with working. However, the Etruscans are also quite well known for their work in bronze. And, of course, there were natural reserves of this. We know that they had access to tin and to copper. And this was part of where their material wealth really came from, is the ability to trade these goods. But let's talk a little bit about the history here, really, of the Etruscans and what happens to them in the 5th century. So, actually, starting in 509, so the late 6th century, the Romans, actually, in the city of Rome, expelled the last of the Etruscan kings. His name was Tarquinius Superbus. His son had actually committed some rather horrible offenses against a young woman. And the young woman ended up taking her own life as a result. And it was really kind of the last straw for the people of Rome, who expelled this last Etruscan king. The Romans went on to defeat the Etruscans in a naval battle in 474, which pretty much ended Etruscan naval dominance. And at that point, really the age of the Romans began. The Etruscans, however, these artisans, continued to produce work for Roman patrons. And what we see there really becomes kind of the foundation of later Roman aesthetics and ideas. So a lot of Roman ideas about art really do come from the ancient Etruscans in a lot of ways. So the example that we're looking at here shows us really how skilled these Etruscan artists were when it came to working bronze. We see here an example that references the Capitoline wolf, this famous larger-than-life she-wolf that, according to legend, nursed Romulus and Remus after they were abandoned as infants. Of course, the story goes south from there. Romulus kills Remus after a dispute, but then he goes on to found Rome in the year 753 BCE. By the way, the young children you see here, the infants that are suckling on the she-wolf, are not Etruscan in date or period. They were actually created during the Renaissance by an artist named Antonio Pagliuolo and were added later.